The 10th century is very significant in the history of Islam. It was during this period that the Abbasid Caliphate declined. Around this time, Mu'tazila or the rationalist school also suffered a decline. It was terminated by the emergence of the orthodox schools that emphasized on the Holy Quran and Hadith.
During this 10th century, we also see the emergence of the Turks. We know that the Turks embraced Islam and emerged as a very powerful group within the Islamic civilization.
Another significant development in the Islamic world during the 10th century was the Sufi movement or Sufism. In this program, we shall look into Sufism in India during the Delhi Sultanate. Initially, the Sufis were known as mystics in the Islamic world. The term Sufi evolved much later.
During the 10th century, we see that the Abbasid caliphs were politically defeated, and they were the patrons of the Mu'tazila school, otherwise known as the rationalist school of Islam. They believed that we should not follow the Sharia literally. We should interpret Sharia according to changing circumstances. They were so much rationalists that they even went to the extent of claiming that Quran was not the word of God, Quran was created. And for this reason, for their rationalist view, they were very much condemned in the Islamic world by the orthodox elements. They were labeled as skeptics within the Islamic world because of their rationalist viewpoints regarding scriptures. Actually, they applied aql or reason while interpreting scriptures. Now, with the decline of this rationalist school, with the decline of the Abbasid caliphs, and with the emergence of the Turks, we also see the emergence of orthodox elements within Islam. We also see the emergence of Sufis within Islam.
During the 8th century, there were a few well-known mystics in the Islamic world. Hassan Basri of Basra and his disciple Rabaya Basri were prominent among them.
These early mystics, they were very much annoyed to see the vulgar display of wealth in the Islamic world, which became a part of the Islamic world in the aftermath of political and military triumph in the Islamic world. Now they reminded the Muslim community that they should emulate the Prophet and they should go back to the prophetic era. They should lead a life of simplicity and austerity and should not indulge in pomposity and gay and colorful life. Because by doing these things like leading a gay and colorful life, they will only deviate from the path of true Islam.
These mystics of the Islamic world later came to be known as Sufis. There are many versions regarding the evolution of the term Sufi.
In the Middle East and also in West Asia, there were Islamic mystics who used to wear a sort of long flowing patched garment manufactured of coarse wool known in that part of the world as Suf. That's why they came to be known as Sufis. According to another view, these early mystics wanted to purify their heart in spiritual terms. So purification in Arabic meant Safa. So from Safa they became known as Sufis. There is even another view regarding the emergence of the term Sufi. The early followers of the Prophet who performed hijrat, or those who migrated from Mecca to Medina, they used to lie down on long benches because they were not sheltered easily in the new world. And they used to lie down on the long benches known as Sufa, S-U-F-F-A, Sufa. So this is symbolic. Since they used to lie down on benches at night, it implied that they were prepared to lead a life of simplicity and austerity, emulating their holy prophet. So that's why they were known as Sufis. This is the third interpretation.
Hassan Basri and Rabaya Basri put emphasis on namaz or prayer, fasting and continuous recitation of the name of God or Allah.
Continual recitation of God's name that is in the Islamic world known as zikr, and constant remembrance of the name of God is known as fikr. So zikr and fikr became a part of Sufi life in this way.
During the 10th century, Sufis flourished in the Middle East and West Asia. But it took them about a century to come to India. They reached the Indian subcontinent around the 11th century.
We have to remember that even before the advent of political Islam, even before the political and military success of Islam in the Indian subcontinent, we see the emergence of Sufis or Sufism. Now initially these Sufi saints were spiritual loners. Initially they did not form any silsila or Sufi order. Later on we shall see that Sufi orders or silsilas would emerge in the Indian subcontinent. Sufi philosophy put emphasis on a sort of irresistible urge on the part of the devotee to be united with God. It is exemplified in the poetry of Amir Khusru, who is otherwise known as the doyen of Qawwali or the doyen of Sufi music in the Indian subcontinent. Now he flourished in the 13th century and he died in the 14th century. I mean Amir Khusru, a great poet who served as a court poet under at least 3 or 4 Delhi sultans.
Abul Hasan Yamin al-Din Khusru, better known as Amir Khusru, was a musician, scholar and a poet. He was an iconic figure in the cultural history of the Indian subcontinent. A Sufi mystic and a spiritual disciple of Nizamuddin Auliya of Delhi, Amir Khusru wrote poems in Persian. He is often called the father of Qawwali. He enriched the Hindustani classical music by introducing Persian and Arabic elements into it. He initiated the Khyal and the Tarana styles of music. The invention of the musical instrument, popularly known as tabla, is attributed to Amir Khusru.
In his Dewan, he used to say, Man tu shudam, tu man shudi, man tan shudam, tu jan shudi, takas nagwed bad azi, man digaram, tu digri. That is, I become thou, thou become I become the body, and thou become the soul. After that, no one can say that we are separated. And this is a reflection of the Sufi philosophy, which puts emphasis on this irresistible urge on the part of the devotee to be united with the Supreme Being or Allah.
Ever since historical times, the Indian subcontinent has been the cradle to a composite culture. In this context, another Sufi philosophy became widely popular. It was Wahadat al-Wujud, meaning the unity of being.
In Persian, the Sufis used to say, Hama ust, that is, everything is He with capital H. In other words, God is reflected in everything. God is reflected in a living object, God is reflected in an inanimate object, God is reflected in a Muslim, God is reflected in a non-Muslim. In other words, if we interpret it in the context of India's multiculturalism, we can say that since God is also reflected in a non-Muslim, we cannot simply denounce or condemn a non-Muslim as a kafir. Now this was a step forward, and this was a remarkable development in the context of India's composite culture. This proved that the Sufis were prepared to preach the inclusive nature of their philosophy. Now this inclusive nature, this composite culture, this multiculturalism is very important, especially during the initial stage of empire building. Now the Delhi sultans were quite aware of the importance of heterogeneity as a part and parcel of building empire in the Indian subcontinent, where the majority population were non-Muslims. And under such circumstances, that the Sufis played a significant role.
There were many Sufi orders. These were usually known as Sufi silsilas. Though initially the Sufis were spiritual loners, later they organized themselves into groups.
The emergence of silsilas provided them with an opportunity to sustain themselves against the assault of the orthodox elements within Islamic civilization and culture. And this gave them a sort of perpetuity, a sort of continuity. So the silsilas played a significant role. the Sufi movement in the Indian subcontinent is characterized by heterogeneity. It's a multi-layered movement. It was not a homogeneous movement. That is, all the Sufi silsilas did not speak in the same voice. For example, if you think about the Chistis, the Chisti silsila, it was one of the earliest silsila to flourish in the Indian subcontinent. Since the beginning of the 13th century, we see a famous Sufi saint, rather a patron saint known as, or who became famous as Moinuddin Chisti, and later on he flourished in Ajmer. That's why he became more famous and popular as Moinuddin Chisti Ajmeri. He became the patron saint of the Chisti Sufis in India.
The Chisti order of the Sufis stayed away from politics and state affairs.
They also distanced themselves from a hedonistic life, from wealth, and they led a life of simplicity and even poverty. It reminds us of what Prophet said, as is mentioned in the famous hadith, that al fakr fakri, that is, I take pride in my poverty. And the Chistis believed that they were following the legacy of the Prophet by leading a simple and austere life. Of course, other Sufi silsilas did not agree with this view. For example, the Suravardis or the Qadris or even the Naqshbandis believed that it is better or it is useful to maintain a close relationship with state power, because by receiving state patronage, some of the Sufis believed that they can carry forward their philanthropic or munificent activities. Similarly, their attitude towards wealth also was different from that of the Chisti Sufis in the Indian subcontinent. Some of the Sufi silsilas, such as the Naqshbandiyas, the Qadriyas or the Suravardiyas, they claimed that if we accept wealth, it is useful because we can spend that wealth for the benefit of the common people and we can carry forward our philanthropic activities. So in this way, in terms of their attitude towards wealth, their attitude towards politics, the Sufi silsilas differed from each other. Not only that, they also differed from each other in terms of their attitude towards physical labor, manual labor, and also their attitude towards music, I mean Sufi music, popularly known as Sama.
The present version of Sama is popularly known as Qawwali. The Chistis were usually fond of Sama.
Now some of the Suravardi Sufis were also fond of Sama. So it's a complex movement. Within a particular silsila or within a particular order, you will find Sufis who were in favor of Sama. You will also find some other Sufis who were not favorably disposed towards Sama. You have to understand this complexity of the Sufi movement. It also confirms our hypothesis that Sufism is characterized by heterogeneity, especially when we study Sufism in its South Asian context.
Delhi was the center of power in India during the Sultanate period. Then why did the famous Sufi saint Moinuddin Chisti choose Ajmer to be his center of activities?
Sufism flourished around one institution known as Khanqa or hospice. It is very important because Khanqa was administered and organized just like a Buddhist monastery or just like a Christian monastery which flourished in medieval Europe. Now, Moinuddin Chisti, just like some other Chisti Sufis, believed that if Sufism flourished in a place that constituted the periphery of the Sultanate or periphery of political power, it would be easier to carry out spiritual activities in the quiet environment of a place that is remote from the heart of political power. So they picked up these sort of small towns known as Qasbas. There was also Fariduddin Ganji Shakkar, a famous Punjabi Sufi saint cum poet, who picked up first Hansi and then Ajodhan as his center of activities. Now these were minor towns, small towns known as Qasba. So in other words, we can say that since the Sufis picked up as their center of activities such Qasba or small towns, they also contributed to the process of urbanization in the Indian subcontinent.
The Sufi movement or Sufism became extremely dominant in the Islamic world during the 10th century. The Sufis were initially known as mystics in the Islamic world. Later, the term Sufi evolved. There were many Sufi orders, usually known as Sufi silsilas. The Chishti order of the Sufis was usually fond of Sama. Chishti Sufi silsila was one of the most prevalent Sufi orders in the Indian subcontinent. Many of the Chishti Sufi saints were very popular too.
We can mention Khaja Kutubuddin Bakhtiar Kaki, who flourished in the 13th century, and even before his arrival in Delhi, his fame was widely known. Even Altamash was well aware of his fame. He was welcomed by Iltutmish or Altamash in Delhi, but the ulama or the orthodoxy, Islamic orthodoxy, was not favorably disposed towards Khaja Kutubuddin Bakhtiar Kaki. They claimed that this particular Sufi saint was fond of Sufi music or sama, which is not acceptable according to Sharia, and they advised Altamash to just ban Kutubuddin Bakhtiar Kaki. But Altamash was a powerful monarch. He was not prepared to accept this sort of order from the ulama. He just supported Kutubuddin Bakhtiar Kaki.
Iltutmish had accepted a Sufi saint like Kutubuddin Bakhtiar Kaki. For this, he even dared to antagonize the orthodox ulema. Such an act was indeed significant on the part of Iltutmish.
Altamash was building up an empire, and during this empire building process, he realized that situation in India was different. Here the population was not predominantly Muslim. Here Muslim population was overwhelmed by the non-Muslim population. In other words, one of the characteristic features of empire is heterogeneity, is its heterogeneous nature. So by sustaining heterogeneity, by sustaining and patronizing composite culture, he can carry forward that empire building process in a rudimentary stage. This was the understanding, and of course perfect understanding of Altamash, and also by this idea was shared by some other sultans who flourished in Delhi.
There were also other popular Chishti Sufis in the Indian subcontinent. Special mention should be made of Baba Fariduddin Ganji Shakkar.
He was also very much famous among the Sikhs. So it is not surprising that this famous Sufi poet who composed poetry, and his poetry was also mentioned by Guru Nanak, and his poetry found a place, respectable position in Guru Granth Sahib. This is interesting because even today when you see that the Sikhs perform their pilgrimage to the Gurdwaras now dotted over Pakistan, now they never fail to visit the shrine of Sheikh Fariduddin Ganji Shakkar that is now situated in Pakpatan in western Punjab, now it is in Pakistan. So it proves that the Sufi shrines could, and still today they can attract visitors who represent different religious beliefs and practices. This is important from the perspective of India's composite culture, India's multiculturalism. There were some Sufis who moved in conformity with the Sharia or scriptures. They were known as the Ba-Shara Sufis in the Indian subcontinent. There were also Sufis who did not move in conformity with the Sharia. They were often denounced by the orthodoxy as the Be-Shara Sufis in the Indian subcontinent.
The Sufis made significant contributions so far as the development of the regional languages in India was concerned. They also played an important role in the dissemination of knowledge in different Indian languages.
For example, if you study the efflorescence of the Bengali language, or the Punjabi language, or the Sindhi language, or even the Dakhini Urdu, you will find that one or the other Sufi played a significant role behind such a development. There were also classical Sufi poets like Amir Khusru who wanted to bring about a fusion between the classical language, that was Persian, and the indigenous language or regional languages. He used to say, or he used to compose rather intentionally, Bea Baradar Aure Bhai, Benoshi Mother Boitre Mai. That is, he was just combining the classical language, that was Persian, with the indigenous language, that was Brajo Bhasha. In this way, Urdu language developed. By trying to combine the classical language and the vernacular language, they also probably played a part, significant part, in bringing the elite and the masses closer to each other.
In order to have a flourishing composite culture in India, it was important to strengthen the efforts to bring the masses and the elites together. Such a step was taken by some Sufi orders of South Asia.
The Chishti Sufis particularly, they appreciated and even tried to legitimize manual labor, physical activities like cultivation and other sort of activities. In this way, they could come very much closer to the common masses of India. For example, in Upper Ganges, where Muslim population is not significant, the Chistis could become very much popular because of this effort to legitimize manual labor. In this way, they could come closer to the toiling millions of India.
Like most religious movements, Sufism had also sailed through a series of evolution.
Sufi movement revolved around the institution known as Khanqa or Sufi hospice. But later on, we do not see learned and charismatic Sufis. So the place of Khanqa was now taken by the Dargah or the Sufi shrine or the tomb of the grave. On the grave, they used to erect that tomb. So the grave was institutionalized. So when the charismatic learned Sufi was not around, the grave took his place. So grave is a symbol of demise, grave is a symbol of death. So can we say that when Sufism sailed through such an evolution from the stage of Khanqa to the same stage of Dargah, Sufism also sailed through the stage of decline? Probably we can. But in any case, you have to understand that Sufism had to face many challenges from the time of its inception in the Indian subcontinent. During the time of Aurangzeb, we see the religious regeneration movement as spearheaded by the orthodox elements such as the Naqshbandiyas and other orthodox elements. They launched their fresh assault on the institution of Sufism.
During the Sultanate period and later during the Mughal era, the sultans and emperors provided patronage to the Sufi shrines. But much later, during the colonial period, we find that the English colonial rulers were not interested to offer their patronage to the Sufi structures and shrines.
So when the state patronage was no longer available, it became increasingly difficult for the Sufi shrines to maintain their standard of living, to sustain their other spiritual and religious activities. There was another point. There was the development of Islamic revivalism in the colonial period. These Islamic revivalist movements, as represented by the Wahhabis and the Faraizis, they could not interpret in concrete socio-economic and political terms the factors contributing to the decline in the colonial period with the triumph of the West. They could not interpret that. So they believed that since they deviated from the basic tenets of Islam, since they have deviated from the scriptural Islam, so they have suffered a decline in this world. So this worldly shift in Islam is very important in the colonial period. And they launched fresh assault on Sufism. They held Sufism responsible for this degeneration of Islam because the Sufis tried to appropriate many regional elements in their culture. Though they did not understand that this appropriating nature of Sufism was one of the factors that made Sufism and also Islam one of the leading world religions.
During the English colonial rule in the Indian subcontinent, a new group among the Muslim community emerged and gained importance. They were the middle-class Muslim intelligentsia. They valued the triumph of the individual.
With this triumph of the individual, we see that the Muslim individual, or at least a significant section of the individual, would no longer be interested to interact with the Sufis for their spiritual solace and spiritual satisfaction. They would try to derive inspiration directly from the scriptures, directly from the Quran and directly from the Hadith. They will not accept any sort of middlemen in form of Sufis or maybe in form of ulama. So this triumph of the individual with the advent of the Muslim educated middle class, we also see the decline of Sufism. But we have to understand that Sufism is still flourishing in one way or other. It is still very much present in our culture. May it be Qawwali or may it be the case when we speak about communal harmony in this multicultural region, we just try to follow the legacy laid down by the famous Sufi saints in the subcontinent.
Today, Sufism has lost the importance that it enjoyed during the Delhi Sultanate. Yet, even today, it occupies a significant place in the Muslim world. We can emulate many Sufi saints who created a common platform whereon people from different religions could converge for the betterment of the nation. The Sufi movement or Sufism became extremely dominant in the Islamic world during the 10th century. The Sufis were initially known as mystics in the Islamic world. Later, the term Sufi evolved. There were many Sufi orders, usually known as Sufi silsilas. The Chishti order of the Sufis was usually fond of Sama. Chishti Sufi silsila was one of the most popular Sufi orders in the Indian subcontinent. Many Chishti Sufi saints became famous. The Sufis made significant contributions in the development of the Indian regional languages. During the Sultanate period, the sultans provided patronage to the Sufi shrines.